All right, welcome to part two of the quest tutorial. So in this part, we'll be starting to go into the actual coding of it. So let's start from scratch here. So I'm going to open up the Epic Game Launcher, and then I'm on version, oh, okay, I guess it closed. We'll open it up again. I'm on version 4.25.1, so I recommend being on that one or newer if you're trying to follow along just to avoid any version issues. And then we're going to select games down here and hit next. And then I'm using the third person template, so we'll select that one. And then make sure you have blueprint selected and make sure you have with starter content because we will be using some of the starter content. And then we'll call this the quest tutorial and then go ahead and hit create project. And then while that's loading, I'll just move this guy over here so I can reference it. So the first thing we're going to do is set up all of the blueprints and all of the assets that we're going to be working with. And then we'll go in kind of one by one and fill them out. So let's come back here to the content folder and we're going to make a new folder. So right click and hit new folder and we'll call this the quest system. So everything related to our quest system will go inside of here. So inside of here, we want to create 3 folders. So we'll make one. So right click, new folder, call it quests. Right click again, new folder, call it objectives. And then make one more and call it UI. Okay, so let's start with the, oh, I spelled this wrong. QUEST. Okay, so let's start with the quests folder. So come inside of here. And so inside of here, we want to create the base quest blueprint. So right click and go to blueprint class and then select actor for the parent. And we'll call this BP underscore quest. So this class is going to be our base class for all other quests in our game. So it's basically this quest up here at the top. All right, so for right now, we're just going to leave it at this. Oh, actually, there's one thing we should change. Let's open this up real quick. And up here, we want to go to class settings. And we want to hit this little drop down under the parent class. And we want to select generate abstract class. And so what this is going to do, if you don't already know, an abstract class is a class that cannot be created, or it cannot have an instance of it created. So you can see if I try to drag this into the world, it's not going to actually create an instance of it. And likewise, if I try to spawn it through blueprints, it would give me an error and say, hey, you can't do this. And the reason we're making it an abstract class is, just like in this picture over here, this class or this blueprint is the base class. So we obviously don't want to spawn an instance of the base class. We want to spawn instances of the child classes or the child blueprints that we're going to be deriving from it. So for right now, we'll just leave it at this. Eventually, later in the tutorial, we'll come back and add some child quests off of this one, but for right now, this is fine. And then let's go back to the objectives folder. And so inside of here, we want to make a few blueprints. So right click and go to blueprint class. Except this time, we do not want to select actor. We want to hit this drop down and we want it to be an object. And the reason we're using object for this is because, well, it doesn't need to be an actor because an actor has a position in the world, like a rotation, and has a bunch of other stuff that we don't really need because the objectives are really nothing more than just a little bit of information about how the objective is going to be completed, like the name of the objective. It's really just information. So for that reason, we're going to make them objects. So we'll select that and we'll call it BP underscore objective. And so this objective is going to represent in our little diagram from the first part, this is our base objective up here at the top. So again, if we open this up and we go to class settings, we want it to be a abstract class, so we'll hit this checkbox. All right, and then just like in this picture, we have our base class, which we just created, and then we have a child class called objective collection, which represents or which contains a list of objectives. So it's a collection of objectives, and that's a child of the main objective class. So let's go ahead and create that one next. So let's right click, say create child blueprint class, which will give us a blueprint that's a child of this one, and we'll call it BP underscore, I'm just going to call it OBJ for objective, just to abbreviate. So OBJ collection, so objective collection. And then I guess while we're here, we'll go ahead and create the 2 example objectives that we talked about in part 1. So right click on this again, the BP objective, and say create child blueprint. And again, make sure you're right clicking on the BP objective and not the BP objective collection. So create child blueprint. We'll call this BP obj reach destination. And then we'll do one more. So right click on objective again, create child blueprint. We'll call it BP underscore obj turn on light. Now again, these are just the two example objectives that I'll be using for this tutorial, but in your game, if you wanted to create a new objective for like killing something or finding an item, you would just do the exact same thing. You'd right click, you'd create a child blueprint, you'd call it, BP kill monster or whatever, and then you would fill it out accordingly. And I'll show you how to fill it out later in the tutorial, but just want to be clear that these are just examples. They're not part of the system necessarily, if that makes sense. All right, so I'm just going to file save all real quick. And then finally, we need to do the UI. So we'll come back here, and the first thing we want for the UI is we want a texture that represents the icon for the quest. Because if you remember, I'm going to bring over my other project here. You remember we had this little quest icon, which is a little scroll. So it just kind of like as a visual representation of the quest. So whenever you drag a quest into the world, it has this little scroll so that you can click on it and edit things about it very easily. So let's just drag in that texture. I'll have a link to the download for this particular texture in the description of this YouTube video if you want to use the same one I did, or you can use your own. So it should look something like this, but again, feel free to use whatever texture you want. So just drag in that texture, and then we just want to change a few properties about it. So open this up. We want to change the compression settings to be user interface, since it's going to be like a UI thing. And then same with the texture group, we want to change this to UI as well. And then save and close. All right, and then the last two things we need to add are widgets. So we're going to have one widget for the quests, like the whole widget, and then we're going to have another widget that represents individual objectives inside of the list. So right click and say user interface and hit widget blueprint, and we'll call this our quest widget. So quest underscore widget, and then right click again, user interface, and we'll call this our objective widget. All right, so these are all of the blueprints and all of the assets that we're going to need. And I just kind of wanted to set them up first so that we wouldn't have to be creating things as we go along. It's just kind of all here, ready to go. And all we have to do is fill it out. So I'm not really sure the best way to approach this because there are obviously a lot of classes that are going to be working together. So we're going to be going back and forth a lot. But I think in this case, maybe it makes some amount of sense to start with the UI. So we basically want to make it so that when you're playing the game and you press tab, or you can really use any button you want, it opens up the quest menu, just like it does here. So you can see I press tab, and it opens up this little menu. So to do that, let's select the third person character or whatever character you happen to be using. And then we want to scroll down here to the bottom and right click and say input, and I'm just going to be using the tab key. Now you can obviously go and set up some input bindings for this, but for the sake of the story, I'm just going to be using the tab key. And so when tab's pressed, we want to call create widget, and the widget we want to create is our quest widget. So we'll search for quest widget that we just created and hook this up. And then we want to add the owning player, or we want to pass in the owning player. And I see a lot of people do like this, like get player controller, and they just pass this in. This is really not a great thing to do because this only works in single player games. But if you wanted to if you wanted this to work in multiplayer games, this wouldn't actually work because index 0 is not necessarily going to be index 0 since there's more than, or it's not necessarily going to be your player since there's more than one player in a multiplayer game. So a better way to do this whenever it's asking for the controller is just say get controller, and that will get the controller for this class. But if you try to hook it up, it's going to say, hey, this isn't compatible, and that's just because we need to cast it to a player controller. So we'll say cast to player controller, and then we know this is going to succeed because the controller is obviously a player controller since we're inside of the player. So I'm just going to right click on this and say convert to pure cast, and then hook this up. So this is a much better way to get the controller. Okay, so now that we've created the widget, we want to add it to the viewport. So we'll drag off of this, we'll say add to viewport, And then I usually also call set focus just to be safe. So we'll drag off of this and say set focus and hook that up as well. And to make these little reroute nodes, all you got to do is double click if you didn't already know that. Just helps for organization. All right, so there we go. So now we have our widget being created and being added to the screen, but currently there's really nothing inside of this widget. So the next thing we should do is add some stuff so we can actually see it. So if we come in here, let's hit this little magnifying glass and it will browse to our quest widget. And then let's go ahead and open this guy up. So as you can see right now, it's just a blank canvas. And so let's change that. So we have a canvas panel, that's good, we want to keep that. The next thing we want is some background blur, because I added a little bit of background blur so that when you open it up, it was kind of blurry in the background. You don't have to add this, but it just looks nice. So we want to add background blur, and then we want to set the anchor to be the full screen, just like this. And then we need to set the offset right and the offset bottom to 0 so that it covers the entire screen. And then next we want to add a border. So select border up here and drag that on to the canvas panel. Make sure you drag it on to the canvas panel and not the border. And so we want to select this, and then we also want to say that we want it to be aligned to the left side of the screen. And then we want to revert this so it's 0, 0. And then we want to set the alignment, because you can see it's not quite aligned correctly. We want to set the alignment on the Y to 0.5, and that'll make it so it's centered. And then we just want to change the size of it, because obviously it's too small. So let's set this to like 600 and 800 for the Y. So you can kind of see what it's looking like. And then we just want to scoot it over a little bit. So we'll set the position X to be like 100. And there we go. So now let's just give it a nice background color. So let's open this guy up, and we will change this to be like pretty much almost black. So we'll say like 0.005 for all these values, 0.005, 0.005. And then we'll kind of make it alpha as well, or transparent. So we'll say 0.5 for the alpha. And there we go. We got a nice little background for our quests. All right, and then the next thing we want to add in here is a vertical box. So come up here to the top and search for vertical box. Drag that onto the border. And then for this, we don't really need to change anything. I am going to change the padding to be just zeros because we don't really need any padding for this. And then we want to add a text for the title. So this is going to be a title, so we'll add some text. And then if we select this, we want to set it to auto, which it already is. And then we want to change the padding to like 10 or so on the top, just so it's not like touching the top directly. And then we want to set it to centered, so that it's centered in the middle. And then we want to change the name of it to quests. And then I personally like to use the Roboto Tiny, just because I think it looks a little bit better, but you obviously don't have to. Use whatever text you want. And so yeah, there is our title. And then after that, we just need to add in all of our quests down here below it. So to do that, we're going to be using something called a tree view. So if you come up here and you search for tree view, and you drag that down, you want to drag it onto the vertical box. And you can see it's giving us a little bit of a message here. It's saying no entry widget class specified on this list. Even if doing custom stuff, this is always required. So what this is saying is that we need to give it a widget to represent the elements inside of the tree. And to do that, you do it down here under this entry widget class. So if you hit this drop down, probably in your project you won't have anything in this list, just like I don't. And that's because in order for a widget to show up in this list, it needs to implement the I can't remember the name of it. It needs to implement a specific interface. So let's go ahead and do that because we already made one. So if we come back here to our objective widget, this is the one we want to use. So let's open this guy up and then go back to the graph and then go to class settings. So the interface we want to implement is, I forget what it's called. It's like entry. Yeah, it's user object list entry. So it needs to implement this interface. So if we select that and then we compile and save and we come back to our quest widget, if we now hit this drop down button, you can see our objective widget now shows up. And so we can select that. And so now it's using this objective widget over here as the entries in the tree view. And then let's change a few more little cosmetic things about this. So select the tree widget. We want to set the top to be 10, just so it has a little bit of padding on the top. And then I think that's probably all we really need to do right now, because we can't really actually see it yet because we haven't written the objective widget. So let's go in and, well, actually, let's set the visibility first. So select all of these. If you like shift and select, you can select all of them. And then over here on the left, for the visibility, search for visibility, we want to set all of these to not hit testable. And let me just verify that that is correct, because this stuff is confusing and I want to make sure I got it right. Okay, yeah, that's correct. And then we want to set the topmost one. So click the topmost quest widget and search for focusable and hit true. So basically we just want everything inside of here to not be visible, and that essentially means, well, no, I shouldn't say not visible, not clickable, because we don't want to be able to click on any of this and have any click events associated with it. We only want that associated with the items in the list view, and that will make more sense later. And we want this whole thing to be focusable, and only the whole thing to be focusable, so that way we're not having random elements gaining focus. Okay, so now we can go and create this quest widget. So let's come over here to our quest widget, and let me open it up on my other monitor as well. Okay, so come over to the designer tab, and inside of here, we want to set it up so that it displays the name of the quest. So if you remember in my other project, I'm trying to kind of explain what I'm doing before I do it, so hopefully it makes more sense. So you can see this is our little quest widget right here, but then these entries inside of the quest widget, these are the actual objective widget. And they can be expanded. So if you click on them, or by default, they just show the name of the quest, but if you click on them, they show any subquests that it has. So this widget needs to be expandable, and it needs to just show the names of things, basically. So if we come back here to our canvas panel and inside of our objective widget, the first thing we want to add is a vertical box. So drag in a vertical box. And then, let me think. So yeah, that's fine. It can be anchored up there. And then we want to check size to content so that it sizes to whatever size the text happens to be. And then the next thing we want is a uniform grid panel. So drag in a uniform grid panel onto the vertical box. And then for this, we want it to set to be left aligned. And then we want it to be set to vertical alignment. And we want to set the padding to 5. And then inside of here, we want to add a button. So add a button. And then for the button, we want to set it to, so select the button, we want to set it to stretch in both the horizontal and the vertical. And then after that, we want to add a horizontal box. And the horizontal box we want to add to the uniform grid panel. So make sure you add it to the uniform grid panel like so. And if we select the horizontal box, we want to set it to be left aligned, and we want it to be centered for the vertical. And then inside the horizontal box, we want to add a size box. And this should make more sense once it's all complete and you can see what it looks like, but we're almost done. So we add a size box in here. And so the size box is going to be used for the little icon on the side to show if it's expanded or not. And so we want to set the width override of this. So hit width override, and let's set it to something like 20. And so inside of this size box, we want to add some text. So hit text and drag in text onto the size box. And for right now, we'll just select this text and we'll set it to this little arrow thing. It's just the shift period key if you don't already know. And so this will show when it's not expanded but can be expanded. And then I'm going to change the text of this to be our Roboto Tiny. And then I'm going to change the font size down to 18 as well. And you can customize this, however you want. And I'm also going to change the color to not be so white, so 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, something like that. All right, so we got that, and then the next thing we want is another text box for the actual name. So take another text box from the top and drag it into the horizontal box, and you'll see it puts it to the right side of the one we just added. And we want to select this, and we want to change the horizontal alignment to left, and we want to change the vertical alignment to center. And then we want to change this to be Roboto Tiny as well, and then change it down to 18, just like so. So you can see it's starting to take form. And then finally, the last thing we need to add here is we need to add our tree view, another tree view. And the reason we need to add another tree view is because, like I said, these need to be able to be expanded upon so they can potentially have children. So if we come up here again and we search for tree view, we want to add this to the vertical box so that it appears below the button up here. So drop this on top of the vertical box, I think is where I go. Yes. Make sure that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. So it goes below here, like you can see. And then again, it's giving us this error, and that's just because we need to specify that the entry widget class is our objective widget. So select that, and you can see it's kind of giving us a preview of what it looks like. We're just going to set this num design preview elements down to 0 so we don't see that. But it's basically saying, any children are going to go here below the button or below the name. And so for this, we just want to change a few things. We want to make it so that the padding on the left side is set to 20, just so it's kind of like indented a little bit. And you can see if we turn this back up to like 5 or something, you can see it looks like it's kind of in a hierarchy here. I'm just going to set this back down to 0. And these are just preview elements. They don't actually affect anything, so it doesn't really matter what number you put there. And yeah, I think that's pretty much good. The only other thing we need to do is change it so that the button is not visible. So select the button, and you don't want to change because there's actually an opacity here, and you can see if you change the render opacity to 0, well, I guess that does technically work, but that's not the way I did it. The other way to do this, because this will actually change any child elements, but it doesn't actually have any child elements, so it doesn't really matter. But another way to do it, and I think probably better, is to change the color and opacity, or sorry, not the color and opacity, the background color. So if you search for background color, and we select this, and you just set the alpha to 0, then that will work. Probably either way will work, but probably just do it this way, just so you don't have any issues. Okay, so I think that is good. The one thing we do need to do, just like we did for the last one, is we need to select everything and make sure that everything has the correct visibility and the correct focus. So select everything, come up here and search for visibility. And to start with, let's just set everything to not hit self-testable. And then let me double check in my other project just so I don't make a mistake here. So for the tree view, we want to set it initially to collapsed because when you first open the menu, we want all the children to be collapsed. And if you ever want to change that in the future, maybe you want it to open up to be like expanded, then you would need to change here the default value, or you need to bind it to something. But for now, for this tutorial, we're just going to say it's collapsed by default. Let me look here. And then I think the button, yeah, so the button we need to set to visible. And the reason the button needs to be set to visible is because we actually need to be able to click on it. And if it's set to not hit testable, then you can't click on it. But obviously the button we want to be able to click on. But everything else we can leave as not hit testable, except for the top root one. We also want to set it to visible. And then, just like we did before, we want to select the top one, and we also want to set it to focusable, just like this. Okay, so now that is all the widget stuff. I know that was not super fun, but that is getting the widget set up, which is important. And so now if we come back here to our quest widget, you'll see it's kind of previewing what it looks like. So this is what it would look like if we had 5 quests that were all collapsed. Okay, so now let's give this a test. Let's file, save all, just give this a compile, everything saved. We'll come back here and we will press the tab key, and you can see it opens up this little widget. Now, obviously there's some things wrong because we can still walk around. We don't actually have a mouse. So that is what we need to fix next. So let's come into the quest widget, and we'll go to the graph tab, and let's think. So inside of here, we want to make a event on initialized. So we can actually just delete all of this stuff because we don't really need it, at least not right now. And we'll right click and we'll say event on initialize. So we're going to override this event. And so this event just gets called whenever the widget is created, basically. And so when the widget gets created, there's a few things we want to do. The first thing we want to do is we want to set the input mode to be game and UI only, or sorry, game and UI. And that's going to make it so that we can actually click on things with the mouse. So um, we'll say get owning player, which will give us the player that owns this widget. Get owning player, and then we'll say set input mode game and UI. And we'll look this up. And then the widget to focus is obviously ourself, so we'll say get ref to self, and we'll hook this up. The mouse lock mode, we're going to set to do not lock because we don't really want the mouse to be locked to the window. We also want to uncheck this hide cursor during capture, and what that does is makes it so when you click, it's specifying whether or not the mouse should be hidden or not, and we want the mouse to not be hidden when you click, so we're going to uncheck that. And then we also need to show the mouse. So again, I'm just going to copy this, paste, and we'll say show mouse cursor, or I guess set show mouse cursor. And we're going to set this to true so that it shows the mouse cursor whenever we open it up. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to disable input for the player so that he can't walk around. So again, we'll say, well, this time we need to say get owning player pawn because we want the actual pawn. And we will say disable input. And then it's asking for the player controller, which of course is just this guy. So we'll copy this and hook that up. And then once we have this, we should be able to open it up and move the mouse around. So if we hit play and we press tab, you can see it opens it up, and we can now move the mouse around. If we try to walk or jump or something, it doesn't work. But of course, we can press tab again, and it'll actually, well, it's doing weird things right now because we're not done, but we can't close it, which is a problem. So we'll need to work on that as well. I also noticed that it's not blurring out the background, and that's because we forgot to set the blur. So let's do that real quick. If we go back to the designer tab and we select the background blur, we need to set a value here for the blur strength other than 0. So we'll set it to like 2 or something. And so now if we run this and we press tab, you can see it pops up and it kind of blurs out the background, but you can see the UI really nice. Okay. Where were we? Go back to the quest widget. So after here, the next thing we're going to need to do is get all the quests that the player has and add them to the screen, basically. So for right now, I'm just going to add a little to do because we can't quite do that yet because the player doesn't have quests. So I'm just going to, I'm just going to, if you hold down, or if you just press C, it's going to add a comment. And I'm just going to say to do, add quests to tree view. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. But for right now, let's just make it so that we can actually close close the screen, right? So to do that, we need to listen for the tab key. So up here at the top left, we'll make a function, or we'll override a function, and the function we want to override is on preview key down. So select that. And so inside of here, we want to take this end key event, and we want to say get key, so we can figure out what key is being pressed. And we want to say equals, so equals, and check if it equals the tab key or whatever key you happen to be using. And then we'll do a branch off of this. So if it equals the tab key, then we want to close it. And if it doesn't equal the tab key, then we really just want to say, we just want to return that we didn't handle this key. So make a copy of this return node, paste it down here, and search for unhandled, and then hook that up. So we're saying, if it wasn't the tab key, then we don't really care, and we're just going to say we didn't handle it. But if it was the tab key, again, we want to close it, and then we want to say handled. So right-click and say handle, or handled, and return this. And so we just need to close it right here. So I'm going to make a little handy function for this. So over here on the left, let's make a function. Actually, we can just make an event. Let's go back to the event graph. And right under here, just say add custom event. And we'll call it close, just like this. And so back here in our on preview queue down, let's just drag in the close event that we just created, hook it up here, like so. So again, just to recap, all we're doing is when the key gets pressed, we're checking if it's the tab key. If it is, we're closing the UI, and then we're returning that we handled this key. And then if it's not the tab key, we're just saying, hey, we didn't handle this. Okay, so back in the event graph, we just need to write the close function. So we kind of just want to undo all the stuff we did up here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the input mode back to game only. So I'm just going to copy this get owning player and say set input mode game only. And then next we want to hide the cursor again. So copy this guy. And you don't have to copy this guy every time. You can drag off of it. It does literally the exact same thing. And so we're going to say set show mouse cursor. Except this time we want to set it to false so that it hides it. Just kind of clean this up a little bit. And then the next thing we did up here was disable input. So we want to re-enable input. So I'm just going to copy both of these guys, put them down here, and then drag off of this one and say enable input, like so, and like so. And it's really important that you have these in the correct order. The owning player pawn needs to be going into the target, and the owning player needs to be going into the player controller. So make sure you have that correct on both of these. And make sure you have disable input and enable input. And then the last thing we want to do is like remove the UI from the screen. So to do that, we just say remove from parent, and that will remove ourselves from the screen. So let's give this a try real quick. Compile, save, run this. So we can run around, we press tab, it stops us, we can no longer run around. If we press tab again, so if you press tab again, it's doing this weird thing where it like makes a focus around the widget. Sometimes that happens. Let me figure out why, because I probably did something wrong with the UI and I need to fix it. Yes, so there's a couple things we need to do to fix that, which I forgot about. So the quest widget, if we come back to the quest widget blueprint, we need to make sure that this top level one is set to visible. And then we also need to handle the mouse button down events. So come back here to the graph, and just like we overrode that other function, let's override the on, what's it called? On preview, no. Yeah, on mouse button down. I think this is the one we want. So inside of here, we basically just want to return handled all the time. And the reason we want to do that is because we don't want the mouse events to lose any focus by clicking on something else. So if we return handled, then it should maintain focus and prevent that from happening. So if we press tab and tab, it closes it. If we click around, it also closes it. So no matter where we click, you can see if I'm clicking, click, 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 once I press tab, it closes it, and it's not doing anything where it's like, tabbing to another widget or something. If that isn't working for you, because I know widgets are super annoying and confusing to get working sometimes, I just want to go back real quick and just go through exactly how I have it set up so you can make sure you're on the same page as me. If it is working for you, then just go on to the next video, because all I'm going to be doing the last part of this video is just going over what I've already gone over to make sure you guys have it correct, because it's very important that you get it correct, and it's kind of complicated. Okay, so the quest widget, if we select this and the visibility, this one should be set to visible. All the other ones, if you look at them, if you go through them all of them should be set to not hit testable, except for the tree view, which should be set to visible. And then for focus, if you search for focus, that's also the really important one. The tree view is okay to be left as focusable, but all these other ones, well, actually all these other ones don't even have that option, but the top one needs to be set to focusable. And then for the objective widget, likewise, the top one needs to be set to focusable, And all of the other ones, if you click through them, they should... Oh, the button is okay, I think. Let me double check on my other one. This is always a pain to get right, no matter what project I'm doing. Yeah, the button you can leave focusable because we're actually going to be clicking it. But the other one should not be focusable. The tree view is okay to be focusable, sorry. And then for visibility, if we search for that, we want the tree view to be collapsed by default. And then we want all of the other ones except for the button, I believe. Yeah, the button should be visible, but all the other ones, except for the topmost one, should be set to not hit testable. And the button and the top one should be set to visible. Okay, and then for the quest, you want to make sure that you have on mouse button down, which returns handled. And so it should look like this. And you want to make sure on preview key down looks like this, where you're returning unhandled and handled. And I know that's probably... I just really wanted to make sure you guys got that right, because that's super confusing and annoying if you don't have it correct. Okay, so I'll see you guys in part 3.